Hello and welcome back to Dr. Logic awkwardly does logic in her office. Today we are going to talk about syllogisms. I gave a definition of a syllogism a couple videos back, but just to refresh your memory, a syllogism is a pair of categorical propositions where between the two propositions you've got three distinct terms, one which appears in both propositions and then one which appears only in one and the other appears only in the other. Now that's the formal explicit definition of syllogism that we're giving, but recall that we generally kind of informally speak of the syllogism as not just being the pair of premises, but also the particular conclusion that you want to draw from it. So what we are interested in are these triplets of propositions. Your two premises and the proposition that you are concluding from those premises. That is the type of argument that we are interested in. So remember our original definition of argument as just being a set of sentences called the premise and another sentence called the conclusion. So it's easy to see that a syllogism, as we've defined it kind of informally, is an argument. So the next point the next question to ask that we are interested in is, what makes a syllogism a good syllogism? So we said earlier that good was going to be something that we would define specifically for each logical system that we look at. So we are at the point where we can now do that. We have all of the tools that we need. We have a notion of interpretation. We have a notion of truth. And now we can put all of this together and say something about relating the goodness of a syllogism to particular features that it has with respect to interpretations, truth, and also the form of the propositions and the form of the syllogism. So just to give you the definition right off the bat, a good syllogism is one in which the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion. So to put this in terms of the interpretation notion that we've introduced to define truth, what this means is that any interpretation that makes the premises true will also make the conclusion true. If that is the case, then the syllogism is a good syllogism. Now, it's important here to realize that because we are interested in any interpretation whatsoever, this means that the terms themselves that are being used don't really matter. If I write a syllogism down with X's or Y's and Z's, or I write it down with A, B, and C, or P, S, and M, the language that I use isn't going to affect what syllogisms are going to be good syllogisms or not. All that matters is this truth relation that you can get from the notion of interpretation. So I'm going to introduce another technical term. It's not just that we're going to call this a good syllogism, but we're going to call it a valid syllogism. So validity is a notion that's generally retained only for this very strong notion of goodness, of necessary truth preservation. So when I talk about good, there are many different ways that we can explicate this in terms of different arguments and different systems. In the context of a syllogism or the syllogistic, I'm going to use the word valid to pick out the good arguments. So now we can ask the question of which syllogisms are valid and which ones are not, which ones are invalid. This is not going to depend on the terms that are being used because it only depends on the relationships of the interpretation of the terms. And we are looking for something that's going to hold no matter what interpretation we pick. So in a sense, we're going to take a step back and we're not going to care about the individual terms anymore. Now, go back to some of the notions related to kind of the structure of syllogisms that I introduced a couple videos ago. We had two notions. There was the notion of the figure of a syllogism, which is what are the relative arrangements of the terms involved. So if we always keep kind of the predicate term of the conclusion as the term that also occurs in the first premise, and the subject term of the conclusion, the term that occurs in the second premise, and then the middle term is the one that kind of connects the two premises. Well, the predicate can either be the predicate of the, let me say that again. The predicate of the conclusion can be the predicate of the major premise, it can be the subject of the major premise, and same with the minor term, the subject term of the conclusion, can either be the predicate of the minor premise or the subject of the minor premise. And so we identified 4 different figures, and don't worry, I'll give you a visual representation of the figures in just a moment. And within the figures, we could then construct moods by taking copulae and filling them into this kind of skeleton of the arrangement of terms. Now, because we have 4 different copulae and we have 4 different figures, and so you can plug all of the copulae in, there are 256 distinct syllogistic moods. So if we ask the question, what are the valid syllogisms and what are not, we are asking which of these syllogistic moods meets this requirement of necessary truth preservation, no matter what interpretation you pick. Now, of those 256, traditionally, 24 of them are accepted as valid. So let me share a screen with you so that you can see this. Just a sec, share. There we go. You should now be able to see something that has figure 6.3, the 24 valid moods, and here they are arranged by each of the figures. So in the first figure, the predicate of the conclusion is the predicate of the major term, and the subject of the conclusion is the subject of the minor premise. In the second figure, the middle term is the predicate of both. In the third figure, the middle term is the subject of both. And in the fourth figure, we just have the reverse from the first figure. Now, over in the right-hand column, you will see a bunch of very interesting names. Barbara, Celerant, Darii, Ferio, Barbary, Celerant, Cesara, Camestras, Festino, Barocco, Cesaro, Camastrop, Dorapti, Disamis, Datizi, Philapton, Bocardo, Pharazon, Baramanti, Caminas, Dimaris, Phasapo, Frezazon, and Caminop. These are the names of the valid syllogisms, and I will tell you in a future video why this even matters, what these names are for. It's actually super cool. There's all sorts of little important information encoded into these names. But I've just kind of told you these are the valid syllogisms. I haven't told you why. I haven't given you reasons to believe this. I haven't said anything about why all of the other ones are invalid. And that is the next stage of building our syllogistic theory. We have a notion of truth, we have a notion of validity, but now we want to be able to prove, not just kind of wave our hands and assert, that these are the good syllogisms, these are the valid ones. This is where we move from semantics into proof theory. What we're going to do in the next video is introduce proof theoretic notions. So ways in which we can take arbitrary syllogisms and arbitrary categorical propositions and convert them into other categorical propositions so that you can see why something is valid or invalid. Now, one of the advantages of the syllogistic, and one reason why I like to start it when I'm giving a class of this nature, is that there's only 256 syllogisms. If we wanted to, we could go through each different mood systematically, all 256 of them, and determine in kind of a brute force fashion if they were valid or invalid. It's possible. It's not going to be a lot of fun. That's why we introduced this idea of the proof theory, because it allows us to prove all of the ones that are valid and give you arguments that will explain why large groups of the other moods are not going to be good syllogisms without having to do it on an individual one-by-one, case-by-case basis. So that's what we're going to do next time. We are going to finally move to the third part of our logical system, the proof theory. Looking forward to seeing you then. Cheers.